Hello and welcome to Before You Die, the podcast about movies and whether or not they're worth the precious, precious minutes of your life that it will take you to watch them. Today we'll be talking about. Wait. I think there's been some sort of mistake. Does this say The Birth of a Nation? Is that correct? I should I even be talking about this movie? How did this get on this list? I don't know. This is a crazy racist movie. I think just give it a resounding no on whether or not to watch it, and we'll just call it a podcast. Ahem. Excuse me. Are you really not going to discuss the film? What sort of cineass are you? Did you just ask what sort of sinner ass I am? I don't even know what that means, but that sounds weird and vaguely personal. No, a cineast, a lover of cinema. You purport to love film, yet you shy away from greatness itself. The birth of a nation might as well be called the birth of an art form, such as its import. It is a towering work of cinematic genius, heralding the era of cinema as a breathtakingly beautiful, powerful, and creative cultural force. All of film is indebted to its existence. Utilizing every filmmaking tool at his disposal, while Griffith weaves a dazzling tapestry of close-ups, long shots, fades, thousands of extras, and the truly wondrous cross-cutting between parallel action to evoke the horrors of the Civil War and the travesty of Reconstruction on a scale of filmmaking more grand and ambitious than any that had come before it. Should a little blackface erase this movie from existence? I don't think so. Well, we are talking about more than just a little blackface. It's pretty much nonstop throughout the second half of this movie. Plus, the blackface maybe doesn't even crack the top 5 most racist things from the movie. I mean, this movie helped revitalize the KKK, which had been shut down by Ulysses S. Grant in the 1870s. Doesn't that make this movie objectively horrible? Pish! The Hollywood elite? Those truly remarkable people love to discuss the power of film to transform lives or change the world or some such build. For a statement like that to be something other than a pure pile of hog shit, films need to have the power to transform lives negatively and change the world for the worst. What better evidence for the transcendent power of film than the little bit racist Birth of a Nation? Ugh. Fine, I'll talk about Birth of a Nation, but I will feel mildly uncomfortable the whole time. There's a good old boy. Okay, bit over. I did think about just labeling this movie as too racist to be on this list. On some level, that is a cop out, I guess, but the movie is racist just on a level that was shocking to me when I saw it. I was 25 or thereabouts, and at the time I probably should have been less shocked, but aside from the views themselves, which are equal parts horrendous and absurd, the truly shocking part is that these views are espoused just so clearly and so articulately by a well-regarded filmmaker who clearly put a ludicrous amount of time, skill, and passion into making the movie. This isn't like a shoddy piece of propaganda spliced together by some white supremacist hack. This was crafted by a talented racist that wanted to make art. And therein lies the rub with the film. If you trace the roots of film history, not just in the U.S. but in the world, you just come back to this well-crafted monument to white supremacy. It's really all it is. It's inventive for sure. It's ambitious, and it really is unlike a lot of the things that had come before it. Probably most things. So it does have this very real impact on movie making as a economic and artistic force, but it is just so profoundly and unapologetically racist, which really, in some level, makes it like the most American movie ever. Before we dive any further, I'm gonna confess I did not rewatch the movie. It's an over 3-hour celebration of the KKK, and ain't nobody got time for that. Once was enough. Well, I will always watch a movie at least once before I talk about it, and I would ideally watch it again more recently. There are just times where I'm just going to say, screw it. I'm not going to go through that again, and this is one of those times. But truly, I don't think a rewatch is necessary in this case. The tension, if you want to call it tension in quotes, with putting a movie on this list is really its merits on an aesthetic level versus the horrible and the horribly racist attitudes that its creator injected into the movie. Now let's talk about that horribly racist creator, David Wark Griffith. Now he was born in Kentucky in 1875 to parents which included a father that was a former colonel in the Confederate Army. So pretty good bet to say that his shitty views on the Civil War and race, they came from his dad. But I also don't want to be sexist. His mom might have been the horribly racist one, and it could have been both. Who knows? But wherever those horrible racist views came from, D.W. brought them with him in pursuit of a stage acting and writing career. He didn't have much success, but he went to New York to sell a script to Edwin S. Porter, the director of The Great Train Robbery. Porter was not interested in the script, but it gave him an acting gig, a film acting gig, and Griffith was able to find a little bit of steady work acting before he got his chance to direct. And at the time in the early 1910s, feature film wasn't really a thing at all. It was all short films. But Griffith kind of saw that this was going to be the next big thing. This was going to be a big shift in the narrative power of movies or whatever. The powers that be at Biograph, where he was working at the time, didn't want Griffith to do feature films, and they disagreed. So he left. He took some actors with him, and he was looking for his big first project, first feature-length film. And he was approached by Thomas Dixon, Jr. He's a fellow Southerner, and Dixon wanted his 1905 novel and play *The Klansman* turned into a movie, and this was just the project to tickle Griffith's fancy. He agreed to shell out $10,000 for the script, but could really only come up with $2,500. But in exchange, he offered Dixon 25% of the gross, not to cut to the end, but this definitely works out financially for Dixon. So he's got the script, and Griffith went to work on a budget of $40,000, turned into $100,000. He had 150,000 feet worth of film, which is 36 hours worth of footage. He trimmed it down to a meager 13,000 in 3 hours. Now, Griffith, he saw where things were going, and he smelled the possibility of hit, but he also knew the awful racist views were going to be a problem with getting it screened, because this movie was too racist for even 1915. That's how racist it is. So Griffith started small for his distribution. He took the movie with him on the road, set up screenings, kind of like a circus, just came to town. And Dixon, the screenwriter, he called in a favor to his buddy, President Woodrow Wilson, who agreed to make The Birth of a Nation the first movie screened inside the White House. Aside from making that an answer to some Jeopardy question, the fact that this was screened in the White House came with tacit approval for the subject matter in it. So that meant that Griffith got the cover he needed to submit Birth to the National Board of Censorship, who ultimately approved it for a broader release, theatrical release. And, despite the loads of protests and criticisms and some local screens that wouldn't show the movie, it was a smash hit. And movies, there was no going back. And again, this movie was called racist in 1915, when that was hardly ever a thing in that time. But despite all the uproar, again, the aesthetics and high box office takes won out. Movie ticket sales were not tabulated in any coherent way in 1915, so nobody has a real number. But we're talking about a movie that made millions in 1915 dollars. So, this weirdly enough, this Birth of a Nation is actually going to be Griffith's only actual financial hit, but it did make him the it director in the middle teens. But he would have this bugaboo of not being able to keep films on time and under budget. It's going to follow him around throughout his career. But so how about the movie itself? Normally, I would want to give a shout out to the actors, but I really can't be bothered. I'm going to point out Lillian Gish because she's the star of every one of Griffith's movies on this list, and we've got three more, four actually more. Excuse me. And Gish, Lillian Gish's most defining acting skill is feminine strength or something. I don't know how I would describe it, but mostly she just looks kind of stoic and a little bit sad when a lot of horrible things happen to her. Um, and she endures this with a vaguely positive attitude as all these awful things happen to her. A sweet stoicism. I don't know what you'd call that. But in the case of The Birth of a Nation, she stoically endures the loss of a brother, the calling off a relationship with a Southerner, and the indignity of almost being raped and forcibly married to a black man. Now, about that last one, let's build up to it. The movie starts with a tiny and extremely cursory acknowledgement of slavery's history in the U.S. before introducing us to our central characters. We've got the Northern Stonemans and the Southern Camerons. Distinguishing the various characters is a little difficult, but we've got a couple of Stoneman boys who are visiting the Cameron estate in the South, and one of them falls in love with one of the Cameron daughters. And one of the Cameron boys, the Southerners, they see a picture of the Stoneman girl, Elsie, who's played by Lillian Gish, and he falls in love just based on the picture. Totally reasonable thing to do, I guess. But the budding romances are all called off because of the whole War of Northern Aggression business. And yes, the film plays the conflict off like it's all the North's fault. Yes, that's probably the least of this movie's sins, but it's aggravating. There are some epic battles sequences. A Stillman boy dies. A couple of the Cameron boys die. Confederate troops defend white women against a squad of raping black men, which is awful, but it's going to get more awful. Ben Cameron is a hero and saves those women, but he ends up in a northern hospital. He's going to be hanged, but good news for him is Elsie works there, gets Ben not hanged. The war's over. The South lost, but things might be okay because Lincoln is president. Shit, Lincoln's shot. Things are not okay. So we've hit an intermission, and let's take a little bit of racism inventory. We've got blackface for sure. We've got the cunty War of Northern Aggression stuff, and the intimation that, yes, black men are very sexually dangerous to white women, in particular. It's uncomfortable and awful, but it's really, this is just like the racist house salad at Cafe La KKK. The main course is the jug of toxic white supremacy sludge that Griffith is going to dump in front of us during the second act. To contextualize how terrible and problematic the second act is, I'm going to, dive us into a quick history lesson. Sorry. This podcast gets worse all the time. All right. Thanks, Lando. I'm going to try and power through this as quickly as possible. I know nobody cares, but whatever. If you know nothing else about the U.S. Civil War, you know that the South wanted to succeed from the North in order to keep owning other people as property. The conflict was bloody and terrible, and the South lost. The aftermath, in which the U.S. tried to reconstitute itself after the war, is called Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a clusterfuck in and of itself. Number of issues, but one of them is the dubious leader of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's token Democrat VP. Lincoln being a Republican, it was meant to symbolize unity. But without getting into specifics, Johnson took over after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He really wanted to get the South back into the Union as quickly as possible. He wanted to just move on and be done with it. But the Republicans who controlled the legislature, and they were the progressives of the 1860s, they wanted various degrees of economic and legal protections for the newly freed slaves. And Johnson wasn't interested in that, really. And without belaboring it, there was a big conflict. Johnson came within one vote of being removed for office, still the closest any U.S. president's come to actually getting removed, like impeached and removed. A few cursory changes were made, but certainly fell short of Lincoln's promise of 40 acres and a mule for the black men that fought for the North. They got basically nothing, and they had no jobs or skills and no prospects. So um, uh, it didn't work out super well. And as it turns out, all of those white people in the South, they resented seeing their former slaves having any sort of agency or power. And the KK was founded to terrorize them and anybody that sympathized with them, really. So a few years go by. We're in the 1870s now. Republicans in the North, they're slowly losing interest, right? It's expensive um, to keep troops in the South and to try to keep the South in line. And there's a really hotly contested election in 1874. So the Republicans, they make a deal. They remove the last of the federal troops from the southern states, effectively ending Reconstruction, in order to make sure that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, becomes president, and and then we get the start of the Jim Crow era in the South, basically. Now, what I just gave you was a very truncated version of history. It's crude, it's imprecise. I obviously strung together that from a Google search. I attempted to be vaguely objective, but that version seems mostly defensible at any rate. However, if you're born in, say, 1875 Kentucky, your version of Reconstruction is almost nothing like that. It's a pathetic version of the time of a school of thought called the Dunning School. Now, the Dunning School was a school of thought about Reconstruction founded by William Archibald Dunning, who was 17 when Reconstruction ended. The gist is that vengeful, greedy Northerners, hilariously called carpetbaggers, white Southern Republicans, scallywags, and the now freed Southern black men, they were categorically unequipped for leadership, and all they wanted to do was exact revenge on the South and exploit their resources. Thus, the domestic terrorism of the KKK had been noble and necessary. Now, this is what a professor at Columbia University earnestly taught his grad students around the turn of the 20th century. And those grad students themselves went on to become professors and teach that shit to other students. Now, you may be wondering why I am wasting all my time on this nonsense. Mostly because the second act of Birth plays out as if it was directed by Williams Archibald Dunning himself. And the version of history is frankly what a large segment of the movie-going population in 1951 took away as to how Reconstruction played out and brought back the KKK. I mean, people took this as, I'm sure, sacrosanct. It was like, oh, this is how it actually worked. And, the Stonemans, the Northern Stonemans, they're the stand-in for the overzealous Republicans. We get a black man named Silas Lynch in the second act, who's played by some white guy in blackface, and that he's elected lieutenant governor of South Carolina. And he's got a nearly all-black legislature, and it's a horrible, cartoonish it's a cacophony. Oh my gosh, a cacophony of cartoonish stereotypes. And literally, the black characters in this movie spend all their time drinking and eating fried chicken and denying white people the right to vote. It's ludicrous, and obviously it's offensive and incorrect, and it's ludicrous. So when those black men can spare a minute from oppressing white people, the newly empowered black men they're lusting after white women. Oh, they're just so dangerous. One such black man who was named Gus, also some white guy in blackface, he attempts to rape one of the Cameron women, the Southern family. And that woman decides the cliff behind her looks more inviting and chooses the rocks below over the hard place in front of her. Ben Cameron recovers her body and, inspired by some kids running around as ghosts, forms a lynching mob, throws on some hoods, and forms the KKK. Knowing a domestic terrorist group when he sees one, Silas Lynch makes being a member of the KKK illegal and attaches the death penalty as a consequence, which is, well, frankly, a lot of power for a lieutenant governor. But adding to his list of accomplishments, Lynch also makes interracial marriage legal. This is a bridge too far for the Stonemans, who send one of their sons to save Papa Cameron, who was found with Ben's KKK regalia. He's arrested and he's soon to be hanged. After a suit out, Papa Cameron is rescued and they find a sanctuary at a small cabin where 2 Union soldiers are chilling. For the grand finale, Silas Lynch attempts to force marriage on Elsie Stoneman, who is pleading with him for Papa Cameron's life. Elsa's father shows up, initially stoked to find out that Lynch wants to marry a white woman. But alas, the film's ultimate champion for racial inequality is just moribund. when he finds out that it's his daughter that Lynch wants to marry. On the brink of compulsory marriage, Ben comes to the rescue. We end with a positively ludicrous scene of angels shining down on a battlefield with the intertitle. Dare we dream of a golden day, when the bestial war shall rule no more, but instead the gentle prince in the hall of brotherly love in the city of peace. That's bonkers. So what's the final verdict? Should you have volunteered to be a doula for this birth of a nation? I don't know how I could honestly recommend this movie to anyone with a straight face. The movie unironically uses the line, "The former enemies of the North and South are united again in common defense of their Aryan birthright." The most succinct summation of something resembling a thesis of this movie is, okay, you guys totally overreacted, but we shouldn't have had slaves, I guess. But we totally agree white people are better than black people. I would call that reading fairly generous. And while this movie makes explicit a lot of things about racism in America that have since become implicit, there isn't much to be gleaned from watching this movie. White people will almost certainly see this and think, gee whiz, racism sure was terrible 100 years ago. And while I don't deign to speak for people of color, I suspect it won't show them anything they didn't already know. And even if you aren't annoyed, upset, flummoxed, cringing at the avalanche of racism on the screen, you're probably going to be bored. The syntax of film in this film was probably electric to the viewers of 1950s. With all the cross-cutting and the way it built tension. But to a modern, 100 years later, it's a snail-paced slog. It's archaic. You may as well watch replays of Strom Thurmond filibustering in the Senate. If you want a sideways glance at it, I would recommend watching The Black Klansman instead. You can get little snippets from it there and actually be entertained. Almost certainly The Birth of a Nation is not the first racist movie, but it is hard not to perceive it as ground zero for racism in American filmmaking. You probably haven't seen the movie, but are at least vaguely aware of it as a KKK movie from a long time ago. It is ugly and embarrassing and expresses something vile, but more true than we as white people would like to admit. Even though there won't be many films as racist as this one on the list, an awful lot of them are going to live out some of the ideas of Birth of a Nation anyway. So, look, well, I can't promise that I will talk about racism in every movie. I will be talking about it a lot. Typical liberal. Seeing racism everywhere. Can't even talk about really old movies without talking about race. Yeah, well, sorry, all right, Ben, but it's weirder to not talk about it than to talk about it. Anyway, that's it for now. Up next, Griffin's follow-up, Intolerance. Bye-bye now.